Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Jaime Romo. And if you can hear me okay, just type in the chat box to let me know. And we have a few other people we're waiting for, so we'll give a minute for them to join. Can you hear me okay? So again, just waiting for a few people. And if you could, those who are online, anybody, just type in yes or I can hear you. That'd be very helpful. Oh, thanks so much. Thanks so much. Well, while we wait, well, it's not really waiting much, but I'll just recognize that, well, one, I'm really glad you're here. It's a very short presentation, but it will give us some real insight, I think, into the significance of faculty individually as well as in the classroom, promoting and facilitating group learning, that we have a map of how we shift from being monocultural basically to more culturally competent. And it's always a process. It's not an end in itself. And it's really critical. I don't know if you have seen in the papers today about Occidental College with students basically demanding lots of change or demanding for the president's resignation. And then we recently have had that something going on at USC, at Claremont Colleges, University of Missouri, Louisville, I believe. I mean, they're all over the place. There seems to be a real surfacing of student voice, and it's one approach that I read today is that students are saying, well, we want the decision makers to be the ones who are called to task. But really, I think replacing individuals does not deal with the larger culture. It's significant, but I think a lot of change, a lot of transformation happens in the classroom. And that's why today I'm focusing on faculty. So let's begin with just seeing that without assigning kind of right or wrong, just that it's diversity is and will continue to be a huge part of our national fabric and our success. And businesses know this, and companies like Apple, for example, or even Starbucks really promote diversity, and they can be critiqued as well, that's not in the boardroom, but that's more in other roles. Still, there's evidence to say, very powerful evidence actually, in the corporate world, that diversity is significant for sustainability and growth and creativity and so on. So, taken from the Association of California Community College Administrators, there's a study about the makeup of faculty compared to students, and we still have, this is in 2015, still have about 62.7% white faculty and about 28.3% white students, and Latino population is the most significant shift, 41%, 41.5% students and 13.7% faculty. And that isn't to say that a person can only teach to a certain group, but to say that the demographics are shifting dramatically, and it brings in different perspectives and experiences. And there seems to be a lot of clashing with an increased, call it, critical mass of multiple perspectives and voices that perhaps are more in touch with not de facto or not de jure, by law, oppression, segregation, and so on, inequity, but de facto, just in the hidden dynamics, often in classroom, often in larger school activities, in the ways that students experiences honored, respected, protected. So we are moving into a majority and minority um, nationhood. We're already there statewise in California. And basically, African American, Latino, Native American students are still most likely to be in our less successful clusters. So it's super important. Let's look at understanding what cultural competence is and look at how that works in the classroom, and look at some maps for how faculty can become more effective, because that's really the bottom line, is helping students to be more competent in navigating the world and contributing. So this is somewhat simple description of cultural competency highlights three areas. There's a knowledge base, C, and there's a dispositions, meaning attitudes, values, and beliefs. So there's awareness and attitude. And then there's skills. Knowledge-based dispositions and skills are real critical in developing that competency. And it's not enough to be aware. I worked with lots of faculty in the K-12 world and even university who were sick of being aware. And that's only the first step, actually, in the shift from monocultural to multicultural. So we really have to have some understanding of history and context of the classroom and of our students' lives, and then be able to put those into practice. Today we're going to look at the individual as moving from monocultural to multicultural, and then how that looks in the role of a teacher, even though some of this discussion will relate to people across the board, staff members or administrators. But I want to really look at some classroom guidelines and practices, because again, a person doesn't have to come from the same background to be effective. Once we understand the larger dynamics in our institution and how our classroom can replicate that or change that, how we can go from deforming to conforming to reforming to transforming. So let's look at that. Well, actually, let me just say one more thing about this slide. I mentioned the Community College Administrators Association study, and they found some elements that were particularly effective kind of from an administrative approach in terms of students getting the right classes and being on track and so on. But I like these, like to mention them as they relate to the classroom as well, not just to the larger institution, that students are going to be successful, and there'll be, I think, the greatest, call it harmony, when students are directed, focused, nurtured, connected, engaged, and valued. So then this definition by Gloria Laston-Billings, who is a giant in the, call it, multicultural education world, I think this is a beautiful description of culturally responsive teaching or multiculturally competent teaching. Some people also talk about culturally humble instead of competent, that it's always a process. So we have a stance of learning more and collaborating and co-creating. So I love that she breaks down that the teaching is really about empowering students. That's a significant point in itself. And both components, the content, the curriculum, the what, as well as the process of instruction, the how, are significant. And that those are not neutral, and those aren't just kind of in the background, that our job is to help students to critique those, to understand who those serve and how they work to empower individuals and create a more democratic and fair and inclusive society. And this other part, I think, is also really significant. It's not just to develop academic success, but as they create meaning and understand the world, that they become agents of change, so that their own social and cultural success are nurtured, are amplified. And I think that's the power in the classroom, that when that's happening, then everyone has more connection, and more people are able to be allies and to interrupt dynamics or join in solidarity when there is something that is harmful. And there's a lot of talk and controversy about microaggressions. And in the article on Friday, I believe it was, in the LA Times about USC, I believe, there was someone who was quoted from another university, a sociologist, who said that we're going about microaggressions all wrong, that we're somehow validating victimhood, and that he talked about shifting from a culture of dignity, supposedly where people were just supposed to have thick skin, to now we're shifting into this culture of victimhood. And one, I think it's very misguided and kind of manipulating words. I mean, the culture of dignity should then mean that there's respect, which is that people don't insult, people don't marginalize, people don't use dynamics against others to do any kind of marginalization or harm or exploitation. So that's not a culture of dignity to begin with. But anyway, there's an awful lot of backlash and recognition of this dynamic of microaggressions. And that's not the focus of today so much, but just to recognize that these are what day-to-day things happen are taking on extra weight because of the historical context. And we can reverse those contexts in the classroom. So this slide is just a way to talk about us individually and how we learn. So this bottom left corner, the familiar and simple, is comfortable. And it's really important for us to not have to strain too hard to know what we know and have things be familiar and ideas and so on. To the next, the bottom right, the simple and unfamiliar might be a kind of tourism. So we can learn new things by going to another place and being exposed to some differences, but in a very comfortable way. And so by tourism, I mean people who would go someplace to another country and stay in the same kind of hotel and never have to learn a new language, never really have to get out of their comfort zone. The upper right is the real challenge. I mean, this is where I think it's most difficult for anybody, particularly for folks who are accomplished, who are very smart, and who are recognized for their intelligence and so on. To feel de-skilled, to be in an unfamiliar place and exposed to something different. And I think that's where a lot of schools are anyway now, whether it's because of budget cuts or changing demographics or any of the unrest that's going on now. It's difficult and it's complex and it's unfamiliar for many. And that is where the deep learning happens. And that allows us then to move to the left, where we're familiar with complexity, and we're able to deal with the things that are difficult in a creative, productive way. So now I think about this in a different way, in a kind of a colonial colonization model. I'll say the bottom left and the bottom right is the assimilation model. So bottom left would be the deforming. I mentioned the bottom right would be conforming. The upper right would be reforming, and the upper left would be transforming. So giving us a bigger picture of the reason for this cultural competency is for us to help transform society, to do justice, to serve all, to be a sustainable kind of world. And so to give it some labels, the bottom left then could be kind of colonizing. And that has been historically too often the case. The bottom right, again, more of an assimilating institution, and that is certainly very typical, especially for students who are seen as outsiders or minorities. Schools are often the first place where that assimilation process really kicks in and takes hold, has a big impact on identity for a long time. So really where we need to be, I think, is in this upper right, is where we're looking to have transformative practices. And this could be classroom by classroom. It doesn't necessarily have to be all worked out at the institutional level or the largest societal level. And I think we have a lot of pockets throughout society that are practicing more critical thinking and kind of education that intends to help students to take up their role to transform society. And the upper left then would be a systemic model. And I see some examples of that, but again, that's another webinar. In fact, I did one earlier on institutional cultural competency development. I'll have that on my website. So to put some language to these terms, just consider that some classrooms for students may feel like they're just there to survive in, that students listen and the teacher talks, and that's considered teaching and learning. That it's really kind of a functional level of literacy. And I don't mean just for second language learners, but for in a classroom that is some form of higher education. That a lot of times students can't bring their whole selves. In fact, might feel punished, or it would be somehow not safe for them to bring their whole self, whatever their identity is, whatever their life experience is. And when students do bring their voice, they may actually feel victimized. They may become casualties. And there's a lot of discussion about the school to prison pipeline that supports that some classrooms, some institutions really do push or encourage students away from a long career in education. And I mentioned that article where someone talked about we're in the culture of victimhood, as if we've lost our standing in this better place, a culture of dignity. I think that represents kind of a denial of a larger problem, a historical problem, a systemic problem of inequity and of students and many people who are not respected and not being served. The assimilating classroom is a little nicer. I think, unfortunately, I taught the K-12 world, and I was assistant principal there, and I taught teachers for many years. And there are many classrooms where, especially with high-stakes testing, that we're about learning facts and stuff and testing. And teachers may talk about topics, and students may talk with the teachers about this, in this case, students and faculty. But there's not a lot of co-creation going on. It's still a narrow band of knowledge and how to be smart. And so the research, the information is someone else's third-person research. And again, this is kind of a touristy teaching. So for some people, culturally relevant teaching in this area may be limited, to including adding on a few facts, in the 4Fs: fashion, fiestas, food, and famous people. But again, that's not a deeper kind of level of transformation. So we go from deforming to conforming now to reforming. And so this would be a great thing to see more of critical literacy, co-creating. Again, the Gloria Ladson-Billings description of culturally relevant teaching, that students are critiquing not just the content, but how things are being taught. And I think that's what seems to be going on in these protests across the country, where students are critiquing how they are being included, not just the content, not just the structure of things, but how their voice, how they're feeling connected, how they're feeling respected, and how that shows up in classrooms and in other ways. This requires kind of this pioneer spirit, a real engagement by students and faculty, so that we recreate and transform some of the dynamics in the classroom that then allows for the transformation outside the classroom. So this is pretty sophisticated. If we would think that it really in higher education, whether it be community college or 4-year or beyond, that co-constructive literacy is going on, that first and second person research, that phenomenology, that students would be bringing their own experience as well as others, but they would be part of that creating process. So what gets in the way of that? Often, and I'll have to say, I've done a lot of work with trauma, and not just in managing symptoms, but in actually facilitating kinds of sessions that really clear the roots of PTSD and depression, anxiety, and so on. And so I borrowed some of this language from the trauma world. But as I think of it as for faculty, or staff going from monocultural to a more multiculturally competent kind of experience, um, change is difficult, and change for a lot of people is traumatic. So I thought this kind of worked. That one of the reasons that we don't have more culturally competent classrooms is because the individuals haven't examined or haven't resolved some of their own histories. And whether it's coming from a dominant culture place and the whole discussion of white privilege, or if it's coming from woundings, not feeling privileged, not feeling from a dominant group, but related to cultural clashes or things that have not been clear and they are confusing, that those can be seen as kind of traumatic. Um, and that's at an individual level, let alone at, look at historical exploitation and historical racism, historical exclusion and other traumas. And when that's not examined, then it makes sense that people would avoid those topics or avoid somehow the interactions or raising questions that might bring those uncomfortable histories, unexamined, unresolved histories, to the surface. And unfortunately, when things aren't resolved, then sometimes we will reenact those same experiences that were hurtful to us. Sometimes, sorry about that, sometimes when people are coming from an unexamined place where they're kind of getting triggered, that they might respond personally to others' state. So others challenge others' critical thinking about whatever the system is doing. They may take that personally, and they're not able to facilitate others' learning or be in solidarity. Certainly not in a place to interrupt the dynamics that are being pointed out. And they may perceive them as difference as a personal threat. And so someone asked in another webinar, how do we deal with faculty who are afraid? And I'd say very carefully, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But we just recognize that very bright and talented and good people can really come from this unconsciously incompetent place. And what we want to do is help people to get to this consciously competent or even unconsciously competent place on the right. This model is kind of describing somebody from the dominant culture experience. It's not really addressing a person of color or somebody who's seen as an outsider or a minority, who is then also developing multicultural competencies and a sense of being more multicultural. That would be a rich discussion, but not able to really explore that here. What I can say about this kind of mapping is that there's some movies that highlight this, and there's some biographies that highlight this. I mean, on a biography level, you could look at Morris Dees, the founder of the Southern Poverty Law Center, and how he moved through these stages, not recognizing, the kind of bubble that he was in, and then feeling more guilty about not being seen as an ally by people, by his African-American friends or community members, and then undergoing private transformation. And that took some time before then he became a change agent, where he started the Poverty Law Center. Other movies, McFarland USA is one example. If you haven't seen it, it's a pretty good movie, especially if you like running. True story, but so this guy starts off in a town that he doesn't want to be in and surrounded by Mexican people and poor community where he doesn't really want to be. And he's barely tolerant. He's certainly a beginner. He's barely aware of the differences, not in a good way. And moves then by developing a relationship to be a little bit more sensitive about the kids' lives, that they work in the fields before and after school. And then he starts to accept them and develop a real sense of that he wants to be a resource. And he's trying out in awkward ways how to connect with the students and their families. And eventually really becomes a partner, really becomes a coach who lives and operates out of respect and works with, not doing for, and certainly not doing to. And that's where this apprentice side is. I mean, that's a good thing. to be able to practice effectively at an individual level. And then to get over to this mastery, this transformation, to use that private information to serve, to teach others, to be an example. I mean, that's another level of mastery. And this may take a lifetime, as it did in, there's a movie called Bell. It's really worth seeing, about the Chief Justice in England around 1772. He made a ruling that eventually overturned the slave trade in England. And that was, I think, a lot had to do with that he was taking care of his great niece, his nephew's daughter, whose mom was a slave. And those many years that she lived with him, he lived that dual consciousness, increasingly uncomfortable with maintaining the status quo of segregation. And at the same time, she was a blood relative who developed that relationship with him. And then even Blindside, that movie, I think, is another example of how through relationship people can go through these stages of becoming consciously incompetent and feeling uncomfortable, but then because of the relationship, moving forward. And even that movie Pride, if you haven't seen that, it's a different take on how, I'll call it, an outsider group influences by building relationship with the dominant group, and the dominant group then, in this case, minors, heterosexual minors who didn't accept their gay allies, were transformed and kind of saved their careers. So a classroom would really, to be in that quadrant that is reforming, would need to have some basic lines. These are from Len and Patricia Davidman. And the first 6 are theirs. The 7th is an ad. What would it look like in the content, in whatever content area, if there was equity, that people would have the resources they need, that people would have the information that was understandable? How would that work? So there's the what, that's curriculum. How would the classroom practice work? Well, we might have ways that everybody would participate instead of just calling on the most vocal. We might have a use of technology that enable that. Empowering students, each of these, we've worked with faculty to break down what would that look like in your classroom, in your discipline? How, what's the content, and then how would that be evidence? What would it look like? What would it sound like? What would it feel like for students? So that's one way of looking at cultural competency. Let me just stop for a moment and ask for any questions. Okay, I know we just have a few minutes, so I'll say a little bit more about those 3 areas that I think are critical. And these knowledge-based dispositions and skills are common kind of domains in teacher education and in counseling, and I'm sure in other fields. And so for a classroom, a faculty member would need to understand some things. They have to have some knowledge about history, knowledge about, when we talk about diversity, there are different ways that people have described it, and some models are not that helpful. So get some clarity about that. Understand how, not just the way in the past, but even currently, how prejudice, discrimination, racism operate in systemic levels, and understand the ways that they may operate in their own local community, the way they may operate in their own university, and then the way they may operate in their own classroom. And use those to not just avoid stereotyping, but then all this knowledge must be put into action. Values, dispositions, and dispositions are values, attitudes, and beliefs. So it's a stance of reflecting and getting feedback from others to understand difference and to see the intersection, the interrelationship between various cultural groups or various approaches, and really look at areas that gender and sexual orientation um, include or exclude. And this piece about being and have an identity as a member of a team or a learning community is really challenging. I think it's very counter too often in higher education, where faculty are driven to perform and to get tenure and to be rugged individuals. And so this is a radical shift. I just taught a doctoral class on organizational systems and dynamics, and the focus on conflict and power, and we really tried to create a learning community, and that was one of the hardest things. It wasn't just the content that we were working with, but helping people to shift their own ways of working with others. And so I don't see any of these are simple um, or easy. Um, but I do think, I know that through coaching, that people can develop those skills. People can learn to question and examine their own experiences and listen in ways that help them to become better support for the students ultimately while we're here. So I'll just say that it's possible in concentrated ways to facilitate that learning, to help people understand the three things: that everybody's got privilege, everybody's got bias, and everybody's got some adverse life experiences that impact how we show up and how we work with others, especially how we empower our students, especially if we have a sense that they are different somehow, and help people to develop some skills around those culturally responsive guidelines for teaching and learning. And that can be customized for any campus and for any group, and perhaps for committees that work as guides for faculty and staff in their cultural competency development. So at this point, I know we're at a time boundary or just a bit over. Um, Welcome any questions. So I'll wait a minute for that. Be happy to respond. Well, thank you. Thank you. I hope that this will be useful. The webinar will be available to you through a link, so you can share it with colleagues. Would look forward to speaking with you about what's going on at your campus. And this is very, very important work, not just to prevent student unrest and so on, but also for just the satisfaction of people being able to grow and learn and do better what we signed up for. So I look forward to connecting with you in the future. Thanks. Have a great day.